What do you call that noise?
The XTC Podcast.
What do you call that noise?
It was on the 12th of February 1982 that English Settlement was released to the world. 40 years on, we're reuniting two of the people who made it happen. Hello, my name is Mark Fisher, and I'm delighted to welcome you back to this very, very special edition of What Do You Call That Noise, the XTC Podcast. I'll introduce my guests in just a second, but not before I extend my thanks to all of the generous supporters on Patreon who keep the podcast going. They include Pink Things, Humble Daisies, and the Knights in Shining Karma, who I'll name check at the end of this episode. If you'd like to be one of them, and of course you'd like to be one of them, please go to patreon.com/Mark Fisher to sign up. And if you haven't yet bought your copy of What Do You Call That Noise, an XTC Discovery book, now would be a very good time to head along to xtclimelight.com and do so.
What do you call that noise?
Now, a few months ago, my guest on What Do You Call That Noise was Andy Partridge. And during our conversation, we talked about Seesaw, which will be on the forthcoming EP, My Failed Songwriting Career Volume 2. That led us to speculate on items of playground equipment that had not appeared in XTC songs, among them the climbing frame. Well, listener Ed Stainsby considered that we had thrown down the gauntlet of rock and that he would be the one to pick it up. Thanks to XTC, we now have a playground and a seesaw, and thanks to Ed, over by that English roundabout, is a climbing frame. It sounds like this. You've got playground, you've got seesaw. I'm trying to think if a slide is about the only thing. Climbing frame is the only thing left.
Yeah, it's really naff.
I've been thinking all day about the climbing frame. I've been praying for the sun, but the clouds still rain. Every day I make a brand new start, try to get things off the ground. But I know it's gonna come tumbling down. I've been thinking all day about the climbing frame. I've been playing by the rules, but it's not my game. I've been looking up at you so long, you stand so proud and tall. I get so high, but I know I'm going to fall. Every day I try to see the world from a different point of view, but I don't know why, 'cause the bar's too high from you. Every day I try to see the world, try to think of something new, but my head just spins 'cause the air's too thin. I hate my skin and my hair's too thin, and I know I can't win 'cause I'm tangled up in you.
That was Climbing Frame by Ed Stainsby, inspired by this very podcast. I'm pretty sure that's the first time I've ever been sampled. Thank you, Ed. You can hear that song in full on Ed's YouTube page, where he is known as Fog99 Horn. Fog99 Horn. I can feel a challenge coming on. If this podcast has inspired you to write a song in the same way that it inspired Ed, I'd love to hear it. To make it clear, this is not a call out for pastiche XTC songs, but it is a call for songs with a connection to something that has been said in the podcast. So get writing and send your instant tunes to mark@xtclimelight.com. mark@xtclimelight.com.
What do you call that noise?
In last month's episode, we looked at English settlement from the outside in. This time, we're looking at it from the inside out. Helping me do so is Sue Charles. Hello, Sue.
Hi, Mark. Hello.
Sue, great to have you on the podcast again, actually, Sue. Sue is a BBC broadcaster and an XTC fan of old. And I'm just wondering, Sue, what are your memories of discovering English settlement? Did you hear it like in 1982, or was it later that you picked up on it?
I did actually, Mark. Yes, like you say, I'm a BBC music journalist, but long before any of that, I'm an XTC fan. And for me, I guess Senses Working Overtime was the first XTC single I really became aware of as quite a young kid. So that was the gateway single to English settlements, and so I think it's a special album for me because it was the first XTC album I became aware of. And then, of course, you go searching back, you discover Drums and Wires and Black Sea, and it's just for me it was a fabulous introduction to XTC.
Yeah, I think thinking of gateway singles is the best way of thinking of XTC because it is like a gateway drug, isn't it? Once you've got one, you're led further and further astray. You're My Drug is exactly right. Yeah,
the Duke special.
Well, great to have you on, Sue. I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Hugh Padgham. Hello, Hugh.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Hugh, of course, was English Settlements producer, engineer, and mixer. His credits also include The Police, Sting, Phil Collins, Genesis, Peter Gabriel, The Human League, Paul McCartney, Kate Bush, and many, 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 many more. So it's great to have Hugh back on again, as it is to have our very own guitargonaut, Dave Gregory. Hello, Dave.
Hello. Nice to be back.
Nice to have you back again. And I keep on saying welcome back because this just seems remarkable. It's less than 18 months since Hugh and Dave were on the podcast talking about the 40th anniversary of Black Sea. And so it does seem phenomenal that in that short time that I've just made a few podcasts, that seems to have been as much as I've done in the past few months, you were able to, as XTC, write and record around 20 songs, as well as touring Australasia, North America twice, and the UK twice. In fact, I saw you live twice in that short period, and you produced English Settlement. I mean, Dave, does it seem as phenomenal to you to think back at your work rate at that time?
It does, but then it was very easy because we were that much younger and dafter. So it was, second nature to us. Yeah, let's go out and play some music and have fun, do all the stuff we dreamt of doing when we were learning to play and going to school and all the rest of it. But to be fair, the songwriting, the plethora of new songs certainly wasn't down to me. That was Andy Partridge and Colin as well, as he certainly kept his end up as well. Between the two of them, they continue to provide, dozens of wonderful sonic opportunities for a guitar player like me and Terry as well. That's what kept the band together. There was never any shortage of material to work on, and so I have to hand it to Andy and Colin for just constantly being able to come up with fresh material.
It must have been exhausting because, by sort of 1982, almost like Prince levels of productivity from XTC.
But as I say, we were that bit younger. I don't think any of us could do it today. It's very easy to look back and think, how did we do it? But now I'm closer to 70 than 60. That's kind of an obvious question. But then we were sort of when you're in your late 20s, early 30s, full of energy and mad for it. It was second nature, and it was basically what we wanted to do. It was very easy. In terms of, it didn't feel like work, because you're doing what you've always dreamt of doing. You're doing what comes most naturally to you. And sort of getting paid for it. We didn't get paid very much, but we had enough to get by. And, of course, the financial considerations weren't the primary motive, not for any of us. We just wanted to make music and go out and show off.
Do you know what I find funny about doing this podcast? Is that it's longer ago that we recorded it than my age at the time.
Yeah, me too.
In other words, it's nearly 40 years since we recorded that, and I was only 26 at the time.
Yeah, you've had several lifetimes since.
I know.
It's crazy to think it's closer to World War II than it is to today.
Oh my God, yes.
Can't think of it in those terms.
God. Do you know what, though? I can remember quite a lot about those sessions, remarkably, at the Manor.
Because it was fresh, wasn't it? It's kind of, we were, I don't know, I suppose that our synapses were more sensitive and receptive to what all the stimuli that was around at the time. Plus, it was a magical time of year. It was autumn. It was a particularly pleasant autumn, as I remember. Every day seemed to be a sunny day. The leaves were changing colour. We were the most beautiful part of the country. in leafy Oxfordshire.
Well, I don't remember that because I was in the control room all day
Yes,
with no windows.
but it certainly was. There was magic in the air, as they say.
David White had a good question in the last podcast, which was whether there was one image that you associated with that recording period. I don't know, Hugh, what you, when you say that you remember it well, what is there like a crystallizing image that you have in your head when you think about those English Settlements sessions?
Well, for me, it was quite exciting because I had been lucky enough to engineer the previous two XTC albums, which I loved, as not just because I was involved, but I just always loved XTC. So to end up being sort of co-producer with the band as well, it was very exciting for me because it was actually one of the first few records that I had sort of co-produced. I first got into it from working with Phil Collins, and that was only a year or so earlier. So I was still quite sort of I don't know about green, I was going to say, but just going into the studio with a band who you loved was, it was like I was like a pig in shit, or whatever they say.
Hugh, I noticed that you must have clearly loved working with XTC. What were they like working with compared to other bands?
Well, there was a fantastic sort of humour around the whole time, don't you think, Dave?
Definitely. Yeah, it was peculiar only to XTC, I have to say, and our upbringing in Swindon, which was pretty earthy. It wasn't terribly intellectual, was it? The humour, let's put it that way. It was fairly basic schoolboy stuff, but it was hilarious.
You look back now and hear about the problems that Andy was beginning to have about not wanting to tour and his torments and stuff, but it didn't really seem to be prevalent in the studio, did it, as far as I remember?
No, he was.
And don't forget, I was sort of any band that you work with, like Drums and Wires took 1 month to make, and then you go off on tour. So I've known you for 4 weeks as a band, and it's a very intense 4 weeks. And then Black Sea probably took another couple of weeks more, but that's still, not very much. And then we get together. So, and we never saw each other in between albums, really, because you're off on tour and I'm doing another album. So it's hardly like we were the oldest buddies, but there was just something for me about the camaraderie of that band that was, it was just really, really good fun. We worked hard, but it was always a laugh. Do you remember on Saturday nights we used to have sort of a night off and get a case of or a crate of beer down from the pub, and then you would do your impressions of Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and all that, and Andy would take his trousers off, do you remember, and hitch his pants up and do his impression of a sumo wrestler. Do you remember that?
I do remember one or two occasions when that might have happened. Yes, certainly.
Do you know this is great for us fans to hear, because English Settlement sounds quite a grown-up album, but maybe the studio experience was slightly different.
Well, that's interesting. You should say that, because you're right. It is a lot of it. If you read the lyrics and listen to the way it's really put together and written in quite an intelligent way. I'm happy to say that most of the songs on there do us credit as thinkers, but we were still basically silly schoolboys at the end of the day. There was that odd dichotomy, but like you were saying about Andy, he was at his happiest in the studio. As long as he was creating, he was doing something creative and not having to go out and, as he saw it, work. he was happy, and that happiness would always come out in a number of interesting ways.
Well, and Terry was just always a laugh a second, really, wasn't he?
He had a certain bucolic sense of humour that, it was just another piece of the jigsaw. Well, he's a huge piece of the jigsaw, really. His drumming was a big part of the personality of the band, and
Yeah.
but again, he had a sort of very very rural outlook on life, and he didn't suffer fools gladly, and spoke his mind whenever it was necessary. So that was kind of always refreshing.
And spoke it in a very good Swindon accent as well.
Oh yes.
And the fact of being residential in the manor, did that affect the atmosphere and the sort of work ethic? Because you were on site and that was what you were there to do.
It never felt like work, did it, Hugh? Not what it must have done to you, because you didn't really get a break because you were chained to the desk. But for me,
well,
it was like the best holiday you could possibly have. I mean, yes, there was work to do. There was also quite a lot of time off if you weren't singing or playing. There was time to go for walks and enjoy the scenery.
Yeah. In years after that, I came to not particularly like working in residential studios because of the onerous hours and that sort of thing. But for English Settlement, I think it was one of the first records I made at the Manor, I think, and we'd just built that new stone room on the back, a la townhouse sort of thing. So it opened up lots of new possibilities from a sound point of view, especially the drums. And so I didn't mind at all. I mean, the most difficult thing I can remember was towards the end of the session when I think Colin had a cold or something, and he was having problems. He lost his voice at one point and couldn't sing, and we were always under the cosh in terms of time. It's got to be finished by such and such a date because the next session's booked in, or whatever reason it was. And I remember sometimes feeling a bit stressed with Colin not being able to sing at one point. I mean, he managed it, although I think listening to the album, I could hear a little bit of Colin's cold on Fly on the Wall, the last couple of songs that he wrote on the album in English roundabout. Although Fly on the Wall, I don't know, it's all fuzzed up, the sound of his vocals anyway, but
Sure.
Whether we did that partly to disguise it, I don't know. But also listening to the record as I did sort of this morning, just trying to catch up a bit, I've always been slightly worried that the vocals are mixed a bit low in the mix. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, Dave, or if anybody else has.
Well, I
on
actually,
our podcast thought that.
I kind of felt the vocals were fine, that they were balanced with the band. I think a lot of the time the vocals were too loud. This is how we all hear music differently. Also, I felt that perhaps my guitars could have been worked on a little longer to get them sort of more warmer and tone rich. They were a little bit spiky and thin, but that was part of the sound of the band. And I know we were working with acoustic guitars and electric 12-string and blending those things on quite a number of the songs. But as a guitar player, you always want your fader to be pushed all the way up. And that didn't really, that's not the case. Although I kind of, I never had a problem ever hearing vocals on an XTC album. They was always, they were always right in your face. But
I mean, I would always love to remix not just XTC records, but other records with what now, and the technology has got better and so on, and you could spend longer doing it, but it wouldn't sound the same, and it probably to most people it wouldn't sound any better either.
That's right. No, it's how you remember it at the time.
you have to leave it for
Yeah.
what it was really, and we did the best we could.
For what it's worth, Hugh, I thought they sounded great, but particularly I think on English Settlement, there are more, I suppose, pastoral songs. So on the quieter songs, I think the vocals really stand out.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's never occurred to me either. Yeah.
You're always paranoid about your own work, aren't you?
Yes, every time.
And how does it, I mean, listening it again today, Hugh, what other impressions did you have after however long it is since you've listened to it?
Well, from a sonic point of view, I think it, and again, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet, but I think it sounds really good 40 years later. And I think, we were using very, very good equipment, and it was still all analog in those days. So it was done on a 24-track, 2-inch analog tape recorder, and a very good one at that, an Ampex MM1200, which was a great sounding machine. And the console was a Helios console, which was custom built, very expensive console that sounded fantastic as well, plus all the range of very good microphones and all that sort of thing, and mixed down to stereo analog as well, whereas today everything's done in Pro Tools and digital, and I'm convinced it makes a big difference. But most importantly, what struck me listening through to the album is actually how incredible every single guy in that band can play their instruments so well. There was no one was a some bands there's always somebody who's not quite as good as somebody else or whatever, but I mean the drums, the bass, the guitars, the singing is all it's all so well played, Dave.
Well, thanks, Hugh. It's very flattering to hear a studio engineer throw compliments at a musician, because that doesn't happen very often, certainly not at the sessions. But it's very nice you should say that. Thank you very much, because we did work hard. We rehearsed and rehearsed before we even came to the studio. We spent, from late summer, mid-August through to October the 5th, I think, was the day we loaded into the Manor. Those 2 months were spent every day or 5 days a week rehearsing and learning the songs and experimenting, and actually also getting to learn to play our new instruments, because you have to remember, Andy had a new acoustic guitar, Colin bought a fretless bass, and I had this Rickenbacker 12-string, which is to this day a pig to play. It's a horrible thing, but because of the sound it makes, you're happy to work away at it. And that was, it sort of brings its own reward in that regard. But certainly we were very well prepared before we went in, because we knew we had a big job ahead of us following Black Sea, and we knew we had to do something that was going to be slightly different, and it had to be as good as, if not better than the almost hit album that we had.
I think Terry is a very underrated drummer. I think he was amazing. I don't remember using click tracks or anything on the backing tracks. Do you, of any of those songs?
Well, we had to fabricate a click track for Melt the Guns. That was the only song that used anything resembling a click, and that was something that I think you made a tape loop of Terry doing something with his sticks. It was like a little clickety-clickety thing.
Is it that song that's got a drum sequencer, isn't it, or something?
Oh, you had that Tama Sniper synthesizer thing. It was like a trigger. You hit it. You had like a little sensor that you placed on the drum head, and when you hit it, it would trigger a signal to a synthesizer.
Oh, that's right.
Different sounds.
And I'm also thinking of It's Nearly Africa, because that had a sort of didn't that have a drum synthesizer drum pattern? I think
no, it had. We were trying to get it. We were trying to play that as a band, and I remember this distinctly. We were trying to play it in the studio, and something kept happening where it kept breaking down, and Terry was getting more and more frustrated. And he said, "Look, I'm going to play this drum track. It's just one part all the way through. I'm going to play it. You lot can off outside. Wait till I'm on. Then when I've done it, you can come back in and then you can add your parts. So he went through it, and I think he did it in a single pass, that tom-tom pattern. And you recorded it. And after about 5 minutes, you said, all right, Terry, that's enough. And that would have been, you'd have edited that as the master basic rhythm, and we played on top of it. But it was basically, Terry felt that he was being distracted by us. Either we were messing up, or there was something was happening that he wasn't comfortable with. So he decided that he'd do the drum track first on his own, and we could come in once that was done. But as I say, he did it in a single pass, and we came back in like sort of 10 minutes later, and it was done. So
he was like a human drum machine.
Yes, he was. He really, really was, and he was determined that it would be right, no matter what method we used to get it right. It would be right, and he would not be blamed for any fault in that recording. He's determined. There's so much pride in his work, and I say fair play to him for that. He's now put a band together to go out and perform live, and he's got these guys with him now, and they're going to be touring the UK in March, and I think they're going to the States in the spring as well. So we'll see what happens with that.
Wow, what's the band?
They're called XTC, EXTC, and I saw them in Portsmouth when they first got together, and they were fantastic. So I think they'll do very well.
And any inclination that anyone else might join in there, Mark? Or?
Well, let's ask Dave Gregory.
No, I won't be. I personally won't be, and I know Andy won't, because he's. I think he's got. He just doesn't want to do it, and he's got hearing issues, I believe. That's the excuse he always gives nowadays for not wanting to perform anywhere. He's got some hearing problems, and he doesn't want his hearing to be damaged any more than it is. And so that's the reason he doesn't want to be standing on a stage next to a drummer, or anyone else for that matter. But then again, he never really was. It's extraordinary, because as a performer, back when we were touring, I never, ever saw anyone harder on stage, delivering a vocal and guitar, and just come off stage drenched in sweat. But I cannot imagine that guy still exists, as sad as it is. And is just at home, in his comfort zone, writing his songs, playing guitar, singing in his shed. And so good luck to him. He's fine. He's worked hard enough over time, and I don't think he owes anybody anything.
Dave, I think I might speak for XTC fans of a certain age here who were always too young to see you play live, and then when you hear of, I suppose, a lot of your contemporaries like Squeeze, Blondie, the Police have all done the reunion gigs. There must have been the offers. There must have been a temptation.
There probably, I don't know whether, see, the thing is, offers, when you say offers, they're like carrots on the end of sticks. People can throw sums of money at you and offers of great things, but when it actually comes down to it, the promises are quickly forgotten, and you find yourself rehearsing for another money-losing tour that no one's going to buy tickets for. Yeah, there's a nation of fans out there who would love to see the original lineup back together, or even the Black Sea lineup or Drums and Wires lineup, whichever one, and would be happy to pay money to see us play. But it's not something that's because money was never, as I say, a motivating factor, not for any of us. It's down to how badly do we need to do this now? Do we really want to be, because it's actually hard work. Doing a tour is hard work, and rehearsing maybe for 6 weeks just for a single concert, it's a waste of time, really, just to play maybe one or two theatrical shows. You either do that or you go out on the road for a month, which none of us really want to do because we're just too old. Simple as that. But there have been, when you say offers, the offers, we never really took them that seriously. It was just, we know people want to see us, but I'm afraid we've had enough.
That's fair enough, Dave.
I was saying a minute ago how brilliant you all are technically with your instruments and stuff. And I wanted to say about, we talked about Terry, and for me, any good band has to have a good rhythm section. It's like your skeleton. It's the spine that everything else has to hang off, guitars, vocals, whatever. If the rhythm section isn't good, then the band isn't good, as far as I'm concerned. And the best bands have always had, great rhythm sections. And a bit like, you never really talk about Bill Wyman in the Rolling Stones. People don't talk about Colin as being, I think, world-class bass player.
Mm-hmm.
You listen to the bass lines on that record or on any XTC record, but particularly on English Settlement, where I think was one of the first times he started playing with fretless bass as well. His bass lines are literally unbelievably good, world class.
He is certainly highly rated among bass players, and I always loved what he's playing. And he also has a very good singing voice. It's still there. When he put that Scattered record out a couple of years ago, the TC and I EP, I was so impressed with the sound of his voice. But like you say, I always loved his bass playing. The only problem I had with him on stage, it was so loud. And it really, the way the bass frequencies cover everything in a small area, like a stage, for example, or a relatively small area. If it's too loud, everything gets swamped in this horrible sort of low-mid mush. And that used to create a few problems when it came to sound checks, balancing vocals, because of course the singers couldn't really hear themselves. Those wedge monitors would be so loud, and I still have hearing problems in one ear because of a side fill that was installed in 1981 because Andy and Colin couldn't hear themselves singing, and part of the reason for that was how loud Colin played. But bless him, he is a great bass player. He's a fine musician. He's really, really underrated, as you say. Bass players very rarely get credited for the work that they do. I mean, even Paul McCartney, who is to me, one of the finest pop bassists ever, it's always secondary to his songwriting and singing. And yes, obviously, bass players recognise how brilliant he is. But it's not the thing that grabs your attention when you first hear, say, a Beatles record or even a McCartney and Wings album. You kind of discover the bass later on. And I think that's probably what happens with XTC as well. He always chooses his notes very, very carefully. Then he never takes the obvious route, but it always works. And, there were a couple of occasions where I've had to change some of the chord voicings of my parts to match what he was doing, which was fine. I didn't mind, but it was like I say, he always took an interesting path through a song.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, in the studio, it's a different thing. So you don't have a big bass stack in the studio. I didn't really ever know that about your live thing. In the studio, it might have either been a small amp, a recording amp, or even just a DI.
Yeah, in the studio, we're all recording separately at our own levels, so it's not an issue. The volume thing is never an issue. But
no.
When you're sort of when you're determined to create some excitement, you feel you've got to have as much volume as you can get away with, and that can sometimes be an issue.
Colin did quite like that sort of very deep sounding kind of bass, didn't he? He wasn't the sort of guy who would put wire wound strings on particularly.
Well, it's what he used to call bassial surround. We want more bassial surround, which I think what he meant was more third and low mids and that sort of nice warm essence that supports. So it's like a big mattress. that supports the rest of them.
But I bet he hero worshipped Robbie Shakespeare, who just died.
Yeah.
Very sadly.
I think
Sly and Robbie.
I think probably Colin's biggest influence bass playing wise was probably McCartney. But he was certainly into all the bases. Remember the late 70s, early 80s, reggae was big, wasn't it, in this country? And there were a lot of those reggae grooves centered around simple drum parts and the bass. And like you say, Robbie Shakespeare was king of that kind of style, along with Bernard Edwards from Chic, who we used to run through a few Chic rhythm tracks at sound checks when we were on the road. Things like Spacer and Le Freak, and just for the hell of enjoying the groove, you know. Much to the disappointment of the support acts who couldn't wait to get on and do their sound check. We'd be wasting time running old Chic grooves.
And then that sort of reggae influence comes into songs as like to a lesser or greater extent. Something like Knuckle Down has quite a sort of reggae-ish lilt to it. I think you can hear that there, can't you?
It's got a nice lope, hasn't it? It's got a lovely sort of yeah. Oh no, he's very. There are certain musicians when they pick up an instrument, you know, as soon as you watch them play, you know that's what they're there to do. That's their job. That's what they're born to be doing, really. And Colin is one of those players. You know, picks up a bass, he starts playing, and you can see just from watching him, he's not really thinking that too hard about what he's doing. It's just happening, and that's the mark of a true musician, I think. This relationship with the instrument.
Hugh was just saying that you'd all grown into great musicians by this point. I guess several years in, it sounds English Settlement sounds like the sound of a band really growing in confidence. Do you think you'd sort of flipped from feeling like kids who'd got lucky to professional musicians? It were almost like this was your job at this point.
Definitely, we were kind of, as I said, we'd had this album Black Sea that was becoming a big hit. We knew we had to follow it with something special. And also having done 1980, you know, we were on the road for most of that year when we weren't rehearsing and recording Black Sea. 6 months after the release of the album, we were pretty much on the road full time, playing these big gigs with the likes of the Police and the Cars in the States, and playing to these huge audiences and not going down too badly at all. You know, actually the Cars gigs, that was a separate issue. That wasn't our audience at all. Certainly the Police crowd loved us and did us no end of good. So we came off that tour at the end of 1980 feeling a lot more self-confident and a lot more professional, because we played the huge arenas, albeit as a support act, and come away without getting bottled off. So we felt
you know you are responsible for getting me the gig of working with the Police.
That's right. I believe yes, Sting, because we shared a bus with them on the last American tour in November 1980, and we got quite friendly with them. And Sting was very curious about. He obviously must have heard the Black Sea album and liked the way it sounded. So he asked Andy who the recording engineer was. Of course, it was you. So Andy passed on your details, I believe, to Sting, and the rest is history.
If you like, Drums and Wires was wires and drums. Black Sea was even more wires and even more drums. And then the band come to you, the band that you've got very familiar with, and suddenly here with, as you've already said, with the fretless basses and the acoustic guitars and so on. Was that a surprise to you that this sort of new acoustic feel was coming for a band that had looked as though it might even have been getting heavier and heavier?
Not that I remember. I mean, don't forget, I only heard the songs for, I think probably the first time in the studio. I do remember us going for a get-together dinner at Highworth. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah.
And there was a pub in Highworth, or a hotel. And I remember we had a sort of pre-recording dinner
Yes.
there.
Yes, I'd forgotten that. Yeah, that's right. I think it might have been the Jesmond House in Highworth, which is still there, actually,
Yeah,
that hotel.
is it? But I don't remember. I remember it being more of a social than me listening to the demos.
Yes, we wouldn't have inflicted the demos off it.
Did you even have demos?
Yeah, I believe there were demos. Yes, I think Andy and Colin had Porter Studio recorders, the little 4-track Porter Studios that were all the go with the cassettes. Yes.
But going back to Mark's question, no, I don't remember. With the fact that there were more acoustic instruments and things, they all complemented the songs. The guys would start playing a song, I don't know, Yacht Dance or something, and it was just you got out the instruments that you had agreed to play, and kind of off it went, I suppose.
But I note from my notebook here, the first song we actually got to work on when we loaded into the Manor was Down in the Cockpit, which was pretty much, XTC fare. You had Terry's drum track. I think it was Terry was the unifying factor between the Black Sea period and the English settlement style. The drums remained the same. And so it probably didn't sound that different to you, Hugh, from that.
That's true. Actually, that song, when I was making a few notes when I was listening to the album earlier, I got down as good fun, quirky XTC.
Yes. Yeah.
And it is really, isn't it?
Yes. I have to say, though, to be honest, that's my least favourite song on the record. But it was, I think it would have benefited from just not going quite as fast. Maybe if we'd slowed it down a couple of BPs per M, it might have improved matters.
Yeah.
But that said, that's only a small criticism.
Yeah. And what is your favourite song?
I think my favourite is Jason and the Argonauts.
Ah.
But I like Yacht Dance as well. And of course, Senses Working Overtime is, the indoor for a lot of people, not just Sue. Lots of people who came to XTC through that song. So it's been, very, very good, a very good introductory motif, shall we say.
Yeah.
Dave, how sharp is your memory about hearing these songs for the first time? I'm just like the first time you ever heard Senses Working Overtime. Can you remember that moment?
Not really, because it would have been part of the rehearsal process for the album in the little studio in Swindon, when we were just sitting around in a circle with our cassette recorders. What's next? What have you got? What are we doing now? It would have been just one of those. And Andy would have had his acoustic guitar and said, right, when it starts like this, it's got this sort of medieval kind of, I want it to sound a bit sort of like something from the Middle Ages, like a little folk mummer, almost like a little English folk ensemble. And then when the chorus arrives, that's when the band kicks in and all hell lets loose. That would have been roughly the instruction. But we would have kicked it around and worked out different parts. But I can't honestly say when was I first aware of this song. Andy may well have sent a cassette around before we even got into the rehearsal room, with a few rough sketches, as he often did.
And can you remember in more general terms both the songs that Andy was coming up with and that Colin was coming up with? Your reaction to hearing all of these songs for the first time?
Well, my initial reaction would have been sheer relief. The fact that we weren't going to be going under for lack of material. There was always plenty. There was almost like an embarrassment of riches there. It's too much choice. Sometimes you can have too much choice. That's one reason why the album's a double album. We didn't feel comfortable about throwing anything out.
And also, this was pre-CD days. And one of the reasons it became a double album was technical, really, because we knew we had an embarrassment of riches of good songs. and they wouldn't have really fitted on to one single album. Although I know in America it became a single album, didn't it? But some songs were dropped. But to have 3 or 4 songs per side meant we could get a louder level onto the disc, and it sound better. Yes. And so that was, from a technical point of view, I was really happy about that.
We were lucky that we were able to convince Virgin to put it out that way, because it was, they had to ship twice as much vinyl for roughly the same price. It would have cost them more money to market. But like I say, it sounded so much better, having that much more groove space on one side of a disc. Did make for a much better listening experience. Plus the fact you mentioned that you mastered it. The stereo mix was done to a 1-inch tape running at 30 IPS, which is really high spec. And I think that was probably the first. I might be wrong, but it must have been one of the first albums that was actually finally mastered that way. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because, of course, it uses up so much more tape. And again, the record company wouldn't have felt too comfortable about shelling out any more money than they had to.
I know, God, when you think of it now, no one thinks of, if you go into the studio now on Pro Tools, I mean, memory is so cheap, whereas just one roll of tape in those days lasted for either 15 or 30 minutes, depending on what speed you were going. And even in those days, it was probably a couple of £100 a roll. So the cost of the studio, even though it was owned by Virgin, and the cost of tape would probably be more than the budget of a whole album these days.
Yeah, it would.
But just quickly going back as well, because I do think Senses Working Overtime is a masterpiece, and for me it goes into the list of the best songs I've ever had the
Well, you created it, Hugh. Let's not forget that. And I think it was really brave of Virgin Records to even put it out as a 45, because it's not the most obvious. That little clunky acoustic guitar isn't exactly an attention grabber, not the most obvious one anyway. And, to expect radio play with a song that begins like that, maybe they thought, well, this will give the DJs something to chat over.
And it begins. And then the other thing I remember is the very end, the crow at the very end.
Oh, yeah.
And in those days, you had to get a sound effects record. BBC sound effects records.
That's right.
Country noises or something like that.
Did you know, it sounds possibly like you didn't then, Dave, that was going to be such a big hit?
No, we knew we had a piece of quality. We knew it was, but there was this thing about, it'll probably be too good for the charts. That's probably how we thought about it at the time. Luckily, we were able to get onto Top of the Pops. I mean, that's what shifted it. That's what shifted everything in those days. You've got an appearance on Top of the Pops. If your record didn't sell, you've only got yourselves to blame, boys. So you better put on a decent show. And so that was really it. Getting that song on Top of the Pops, and then there was a slight edit as well in the middle of it to make it radio playable, because I think the full length
radio
version,
friendly.
That's right, radio friendly.
It was always lovely when you heard occasionally the album version on the radio with the extra lines. The buses might skid on black ice. It was it's always good when you feel like you've got a slightly different version from the album to the single, like you've got that added extra.
Yes, that's right. And it's also I think nowadays, because most of the time you'd hear it on the radio today, you probably would get the full version, because that's what is in most radio stations' libraries. I would guess. I think probably the single edit is confined pretty much to the original 45. But whatever it took, it got to number 10 in the charts. That was the highest position we'd ever achieved, and as I say, it just welcomed in a whole new bunch of listeners.
Does it feel wrong in a way that was your only top 10 single? It's hard to believe.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I agree. think it's a terrible shame that we weren't appreciated a little more generously at the time. But some of these things take a while to grow. It's just, I don't know. It's possible that the other singles weren't as strong, or maybe, as I said, they were too good for the charts.
No, I agree. They were too good for the charts.
Did it feel to you, Hugh, that it was going to be an obvious hit single?
Oh, I don't know. I remember absolutely loving it, but when you're producing a record of how many songs we did, 15 or 16 songs, and you're working on them all the time, it's very difficult to be objective about that sort of thing. I think the producer and the band are probably the last people that should, pick the singles. I remember playing the record, whether it was finished or not. I remember Simon Draper coming down to the studio and being unbelievably impressed with what we had done. Do you remember that, Dave?
I remember a few visits from record, but the great thing about the Manor was that it was far enough away from London where you didn't get a lot of visitors. I'm not saying that we didn't welcome people. It's just that they are a distraction when you're trying to work. Simon Draper was always in our corner. He was a good guy. I kind of liked him a lot. He was very supportive, and he gave us a lot of wiggle room when a lot of bands would have been given their marching orders for some of the, didn't.
He's a really good guy.
Yeah.
And I heard him on a podcast recently. What's his name from Heaven 17?
Martin Ware? Martin's got a podcast, hasn't he?
Yeah, it must be his then.
Mm-hmm.
He had Simon Draper on it a month or two ago, and I listened to it. And he was very complimentary about XTC, I remember, when that subject came up.
That's good to know. But he was always very supportive, and I think had he not been head of A&R at that time, we might have gotten our marching orders a lot sooner.
Well, he was kind of de facto head of the label, really,
Yes.
because Richard Branson wasn't actually very interested in music.
No.
And Simon was a sort of cousin of his from South Africa, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Who was mad on music. And if I remember rightly, the 3 albums that I was involved with you guys, I don't remember any record company intervention at all, really. No one would come down and say, we don't like this, or you're not doing that, or would you do this, or...
No, they were quite hands-off in terms of our working methods. They never insisted that we do cover versions of somebody else's songs, which would have been the death knell for any band, I think. When the inspiration is that low that you're being forced to cover somebody else's work, that's when it's time to knock it on the head, I think. But no, they didn't interfere.
No, they were good.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention another song of one of my favourites on the album is also No Thugs in Our House. I love that song. It's got a fantastic energy to it. Again, Terry plays the arse off his drum kit, doesn't he?
He does.
And everyone does. And I love that song.
It's the rockingest song on the album. And it was a single. It didn't get very far. It didn't. We didn't top of the pops. That's why. Although I think we did play it on the Whistle Test. We did a live version on the Whistle Test, believe it or not.
Oh, okay.
And what I remember about it was that big thuggish guitar riff that I play. We wanted it big and even bigger than big. So I had this Marshall 50-watt bass amplifier that I'd been using, but it's just like, anyone who knows those old Marshalls know how loud they are. I mean, just unbearably loud. And you have to get a good sound out of them. They have to be cranked.
Yeah.
But once they're cranked, you can't get within 50 yards if you want to keep your hearing. It's just ridiculous. So we rigged it up in the Stone Room, the new Stone Room at the back of the studio.
Yeah.
And you had your microphones up in the far corners, up in the ceiling there. And an SM57 maybe 6 feet from the cabinet. And so I just cranked the levels up, closed the door with a long cable, stood outside the door with my guitar, because there was no way I was going to stay in that room with that level of noise coming out of the amplifier. And that's how we got the sound for No Thugs, the guitar, that big thuggish riff.
Yeah.
But even so, it was tamed in the mix, Hugh. I didn't think it really, you wouldn't have known exactly how ear-shatteringly loud that was from listening to the final mix. But it works with the track, obviously. But being a guitar player, I wanted it even bigger.
Oh, well, I'm so sorry. I apologise 40 years later now.
It worked, Hugh. Don't apologise.
But if we'd put the guitar up really loud, then
everything
something
else,
like the
yes.
drums would have then sounded small.
Yes. But actually, the acoustic guitar sounds pretty damn big. That was the first song we recorded. Do you remember we had this rotten Italian acoustic guitar, this Eco Rancher, that we'd used on Drums and Wires and Black Sea for the occasional acoustic guitar tracks. And we'd started using it on these new songs. And I remember one day you said, I can't remember what the song was we were working on. It might have been Yacht Dance. And you threw your hands up in despair and said, this guitar sounds shit. You're going to have to get something we can use. Can't you? There must be, can you somebody go shopping for a decent acoustic guitar? So we conveyed this message to management, and I was provided with £400 in cash, dispatched to London the next day to shop for what I hoped to find a Martin acoustic, a used Martin acoustic, which I eventually found, and brought it back to the studio. And you just put a U47 in front of it and said, finally, there was no work involved. We've got something we can use now. What are we going to do? And the first thing we did was No Thugs in Our House. And Andy did that sort of Eddie Cochran, ba-da. And all the problems were over as far as acoustic guitars were concerned. And I think the following day, Andy had to replace all the acoustics he'd recorded on that Eco guitar with the proper thing, with the real thing.
Guys, I just wanted to say thank you for No Thugs, because from English Settlement, it was the song we played most in our house, because just purely the line, making little Graham promise us he'd be a good boy. My older brother Graham loved this song, played it nonstop. XTC were quite clever using names in songs. Obviously, Nigel's the obvious ones. And I wondered if that was just an accident or if it was a ploy.
I've never thought about it. You'd have to ask Andy. He wrote it. But I don't know. No, I think he, Nigels and Graham. Actually, I get accosted by Nigels all the time for ruining their school days because of the song Making Plans for Nigel. But I haven't heard any adverse comments from Graham's over the years. So maybe that's flown under the radar. But no, I don't think there was any deliberate issue with people called Graham. It just happened to fit the lyric that Andy wrote.
We're only making plans for Graham.
It didn't quite work, does it?
My brother was delighted with the Graham reference.
Oh, good.
Just for the record.
Yeah, okay, fine. No harm done there.
You were described as a co-producer and XTC as a co-producer. What was the negotiation there? Because you, as you've already described, you were relatively new to producing. You'd had a lot of experience as an engineer. What was the kind of diplomatic relationship between your input and their input?
Well, gosh, that's a very difficult question, really. I'm not the sort of producer like Trevor Horn or somebody who becomes sort of bigger than the band. I like to think that I'm the sort of guy, we just get on with it together. I don't really know what producing means. I mean, I started getting into producing because I was sort of fed up sitting next to people who didn't really know how to produce. I'm certainly not talking about Steve, but other people. When I was working at Virgin and engineering, and I just thought, well, I can do this as well as as that producer and asked Simon Draper, could I make a record or two with some of his junior bands? And do you know what, Dave? The first production actually I ever did was an EP with the guy who you replaced.
Barry Andrews.
Barry Andrews. That was literally the first producing job I ever did. And so for me, it was really just having a sort of rapport with the band and me trying to realize from a sonic point of view what comes out of the speakers at the end of the day, what the band is trying to achieve and getting the best out of the songs. And I mean, nowadays producers tend to be writers as well, because just because of the way the music business has changed, and you don't really sell physical records anymore. In those days, the producer, the only income he got was from royalties of sales of records. But as Dave was saying at the beginning of the day, one never, I certainly never made records with the idea of making money. One was just lucky enough to be doing a job that you loved, rather than working at the Honda factory in Swindon or something. And so producing. I always remember Miles Copeland, actually, the manager of the Police, saying to me, "Oh, I don't know why, what's your name on the record as co-producer or produced by you and the Police? Producer doesn't do anything."
He said that, did he?
Yeah, so that's classic, really.
Dear me.
He didn't like the idea of producers because he didn't like the idea of the money being shared out
exactly. That's what
to another person as well.
No, that's right. That's what that's all about. But we always felt that you and Steve Lillywhite as well, when we were working together, you were every bit as important a part of the team as anybody in the band. It went from being 4 guys from Swindon to a 6-piece group making a record. I never thought of you as being, doing a job for us. You were part of the team. And without you, the record wouldn't have been made. So that's the producer and an engineer. That's their role, is to help bring the music of the band to the public's attention in the best way possible.
Yeah, and that was what made it such a happy experience to be in the studio. I mean, not wanting to go away from XTC, but the last album I made with the Police, Synchronicity, is a great album, but the atmosphere in the studio making it was pretty poisonous a lot of the time. So, it can work both ways. But it's certainly one of my fondest memories was making English Settlement, that's for sure.
And Dave, do you have, there's the same question to you about your relationship with Hugh, specifically for English Settlement. So you'd established that relationship with Hugh and Steve Lillywhite on the first 2, but then I presume there was something that made you as a band say, yeah, but we want a bit of a credit here as well on the production side, because you had a vision of what you wanted.
I think because of the amount of work that particularly Andy Partridge did in preparing the songs for rehearsal, and then what the band did in rehearsal in terms of the arrangements and sorting and just learning parts and creating new parts. I think Hugh would agree that he never instructed us in sort of musical terms as to what we should or shouldn't be playing. He might have done on occasion, just now and again, just to tidy things up. But, we decided, I think, at that time, we'd already done the production work. We just needed someone to get it onto tape and make it sound as good as it possibly could be. And it's like Hugh says, nowadays producers tend to be in charge of everything. They tend to be writers. They bring in, maybe half of them nowadays, bring in a team of writers and programmers and what have you, in order to create a track for a single artist who gets all the credit, as it were, but actually doesn't do that much. The producers do most of the heavy lifting. The artist is just there to have their voice auto-tuned and to look pretty and sell the record. I'm sorry, I'm digressing now. No, I'm not suggesting for a minute that Hugh is one of those.
It all changed with the advent of iTunes. It changed where you could cherry pick songs one by one, and that was basically the beginning, in my opinion, one of the beginnings of the demise of the album, so to speak.
Oh yeah.
And now, if you look at albums, although obviously there's actually a lot more sort of genres now, but particularly in the sort of hip hop world, there's no way that one producer works through a whole album. I mean, you know, for us in those days, the band chose me to work with them, but we worked on an album together, you know, and we worked from the beginning of it to the end of it, and that was it. And I think it's why the album sounds very coherent as well. Not coherent, what's the word?
Cohesive.
Cohesive. Sorry, it's coherent as well, but it's cohesive.
Yes, it's reasonably coherent, I would say. A good team effort all round. And I think Hugh his expertise, because he was getting better and better. I mean, I could tell, watching the way he worked, how much more involved he was in every little aspect of the sound.
Mm. But, you know, you and Andy, the one thing I remember so well is that your sort of different ways of playing guitars, you had a real feeling of your part and his part and how they didn't mess with each other, because one of the things sonically about making records is if you have too much stuff in one single range or whatever, you don't hear either, and you guys were so clever at working out these guitar arrangements that didn't sort of get in each other's way.
Oh, we did our best not to step on each other's toes. And,
exactly,
yeah, it was fun to do.
Yeah, and so that also made my life easier as a either engineer or producer, because you could make everything sound sort of clearer. One of the nice things about XTC records, and especially this one, is that, you know, instrumentally it all beds together as a recording, a record, a song or whatever, but sonically you can hear pretty well all the time what you're playing, what Andy's playing, as well as listening to the lyrics or whatever.
And not only that, but the other thing about English Settlement that differs from the later albums that we went on to make, there aren't that many overdubs. Most of it is kind of almost played live in the studio. There's a few solos, obviously, and percussion and stuff like that, but there's nothing very. It's not what I would describe as a kitchen sink production, as I might level that criticism at some of our later stuff. But English Settlement, I think, got the balance just right. And even though, yeah, perhaps today there's a couple of tracks I might want to do another mix on. As it stands, the original pressing of English Settlement sounds really good, and I'm really, really proud of the fact that we were able to put that out when we did, because it didn't sound like anything else that was around at the time, did it, really?
No.
And what about the B-sides, Dave? Are the B-sides, would you have made some running order decisions about Blame the Weather and other things that ended up great songs, but slightly forgotten
That's
about?
right. Blame the Weather, I think that had the makings of a single. I also loved Tissue Tigers as well. I really thought that was a great little romp. And maybe I would have put Tissue Tigers, I would have replaced Down in the Cockpit with Tissue Tigers perhaps, and Blame the Weather. But, you know, we only had 4 sides of vinyl. You've got to draw the line somewhere.
Well, it does say something when a band can effectively throw away a song as good as either of those, you know.
I suppose the beauty for Blame the Weather is at least it was the B-side of the most successful single. So a lot of people maybe then at least did get to hear it.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, there is that. Because B-sides tend to be, they're not as neglected as people might think. You know, when you pay, I don't know, what were singles in those days? 99p? I don't know. When you pay £1 for a single.
Something like that, yeah.
You want both sides. You want two songs. You don't just want the hit. So yes, you're right. It's good that was there, and people, because I think it is quite a popular song among fans. I think a lot of fans out there really like it.
Yes, sometimes it's almost like it's when you hear a B-side and you know it to be a B-side and only a B-side, you kind of think, oh, an editorial decision has been made to relegate this song to something B-ish rather than A-ish. And actually there may be a million different reasons why it's ended up there. But you can then think, no, but I really like that song.
Well, there's an argument to say that because Senses Working Overtime was a success, more people heard Blame the Weather than they might have heard the album.
And it was also interesting because you were there on the piano for the first time in a big way, and it didn't sound like what you expected XTC to sound like.
That's true. The piano was, yes, a fresh element for us at the time. We had used it on Black Sea just very, very briefly. But as I've said so many times in these interviews, discovering the pianos, the quality of the keyboards in most recording studios was way, way better than anything that I'd played up to that point. So to have a Steinway in a perfect acoustic environment, just to sit at the keyboard and just find chords and play little melodies and everything, and reacquaint myself with some of my piano tuition from years and years ago. Suddenly I was reborn. I thought, this actually sounds fantastic. I need to be working more at the keyboard because I'm loving what I'm hearing, even with my limited technique. Still sounds really nice. I'd like to get back into this a little bit heavier. But because I never had a room big enough in my house to accommodate a proper grand piano, I never really took it any further. But every time we went to a studio, the first thing I would do, having parked my equipment somewhere, would be sit at the piano and just play for 10 minutes and just enjoy this rich sound that you don't find anywhere else. It's just it's not the sort of thing that you would find in a normal living room.
I remember also talking about keyboards. Another story. Do you remember you had the mini Korg synth?
It served us well, that.
And I can't remember if I said something like, why haven't you got a bigger one or something like that? And you or somebody said, well, it was the only one left in the music shop in Swindon, and it was cheap.
That would have made sense. Yes, it's quite possible that was the reason it was purchased. It was early days of synths, don't forget. And in fact, we did have a Prophet 5.
I was going to say, I'm sure you bought a Prophet 5 because that was one of the first polyphonic synthesizers.
Yes, it was.
That you could actually play a chord on.
Yeah. And that was picked up on the last American tour that we did in 1981. Actually, yes, about 6 months before we did the album, basically. So we used it to do the marimba sound on It's Nearly Africa and the floaty pads on Runaways and a few other things as well.
Yeah.
The horn lines and stuff. Yeah, useful thing.
The mini Korg was great. It'd probably be worth a fortune now.
Well, it might be, yeah. Actually, people are buying vintage synths now. The way they've been buying vintage guitars and the prices have been soaring and soaring.
You couldn't give them away at one point, synths.
But who knows? I think a lot of, there's a lot of nostalgia involved in collecting old stuff. Certainly it is with where guitars are concerned.
Yeah. But I remember you had a pretty serious collection of guitars, once you bought that Rickenbacker as well. Between you and Andy, there was some really, you had a Gibson.
Well, there's a whole heap more of them now, Hugh, I can promise you.
Oh, really?
I got a house full of the bloody things. But that's my passion, and it's nearly always old vintage stuff that I'm most interested in.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just been, I've been lucky enough not having had to sell anything in order to pay any bills. And I only buy guitars when I can afford it. I don't sort of put myself into hock just because I have to have something. I'll wait until I can afford to pay for it. And I've just accumulated a lot over the years, and haven't actually had to part with very many.
Good for you.
Maybe we could just finish with a sort of rounding up observations about how you look back and think of that. I mean, Hugh, the third of 3 albums with XTC, does it still, what position does it take in your memory?
Well, it's in my top 2 albums, or 3 albums probably, that I've made. I'm unbelievably proud of it. I think XTC has always been the most underrated band ever, and I just thank the Lord that I was around at the right time in the right place to be able to work with such a great band. That's the way I look at it, and I know it sounds very sort of fawning and stuff, but I mean it.
Well, thank you, Hugh. That's very, very, very complimentary and very flattering, bearing in mind the work that you've done since, which has been incredible. I mean, the fact that when we loaded into the Manor in October 1981, you had 2 albums, The Police at number 1, which I think was Ghost in the Machine, and at number 3, the Genesis Abacab, or was it the other way around? But those 2 albums were top 5 in England, and yet here you were working with 4 oiks from Swindon. And I say thank you very, very much, Hugh. It's really, really so glad you could have joined us, because that record wouldn't have existed without you. And,
well, you're very kind.
No, not at all.
You don't play your own records very often, but doing prep for this podcast, I obviously listened through to it a couple of times, and that's when you go, oh my God, that was such a good album, and the band was so good, and everyone's playing was like, oh my God, it's just amazing, and you realize how blessed I was to be able to be a part of all that at that time.
I also think it was the happiest that the 4 guys in XTC were playing and being together, because it was before, really, we were still a band, we were still supposedly a touring band. We were still very much a group of people with a single idea, a single focus. And we were all still friends and getting along famously. And then you became part of that. So it was a very, very happy time. I know there were a couple of grumbles, there were a couple of hissy fits, not as many as there had been perhaps a few years later. But I remember the whole process and working at that wonderful place at the Manor, which was, I think, a magical place. Not just the studio, but the house as well, and everything in it. Really amazing place. And like you say, I think we were all really, really blessed at that time to have had that environment to work in and that music to work on, and to come out of it with a record that good. It's that's why you do what you do.
Well, thank you, but it takes everyone, and even the kitchen staff and everything, it was just a good vibe, wasn't it?
Very much so.
It was a good vibe.
Yeah.
Just a quick question, which may not be relevant, but was that the last record that Terry played on? The last XTC record?
No, he played on 2 songs on the following album, Mummer. And we'd gone in to do a couple of singles or a couple of tracks, as a bit like we did with Settlement when we worked with Alan Winstanley and who was it, Clive Langer. We did Ball and Chain and Punch and Judy as a precursor to the album, which the record company didn't like. We did a similar thing with the Mummer album, and we did Beating of Hearts and Wonderland, those 2 songs, which are the 2 songs that open up the Mummer album. Terry worked on those. He played on those 2 songs, and he did some B-sides as well. I think he played on Toys or Desert Island, which later came out as part of an EP package. But then that would have been around about September of 1982. And I think he quit in the October or November time, and it was early winter of 82. And then we had to find another drummer, and we worked with this producer, Steve Nye,
Okay.
who had a very, very different sort of work ethic. He was fine, actually, Steve. I like him a lot. I think he did good work, but whether he was right for XTC, I don't know. But some people say yes, others not so. But, you know, it was it. We were just sort of moving on and trying different things. We were always, you know, sort of exploring, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, it's extraordinary hearing the two of you thanking each other for the work that you did on that album, because I just want to say thank you for 40 years of listening pleasure. If anybody's got any thanks to give, it's to me, and I'm sure Sue will agree with that, and everybody listening to this podcast. So thank you very much for 40 years of English settlement, to Hugh, to Dave, and also to Sue for asking such fantastic questions. Thank you, Sue, for that. This has been What Do You Call That Noise, an XTC podcast, and we'll be back again next month with even more XTC goodness. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having an XTC podcast.
Yes, thank you for listening.
What do you call that noise? What do you call that noise?
Thanks again to Sue, Dave, and Hugh. What a conversation that was. And many, many thanks to the podcasters' supporters on Patreon who make it all possible, including the following Knights in Shining Karma: Terry Arnott, Kevin Burt, Liam Duggan, Jamie Dunn, Peter Fermoy, Leslie Gooch, Robert Graham, Marek Krause, Jesper Kumberg, Robert Lawlaw, Dennis LeCourrier, Liz Lynch, Ian Morris, Youssef Murrah, Murray Meikle, Kevin Murray, Karen Neal, Amy Parkinson, Doug Perry, Mark Reed, James Reimer, Simon Slatehome, Michael Sutcliffe, Mark Thomas, and Nigel Waller. If you'd like to support the XTC podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Mark Fisher. Thank you very much for listening. Back next month with more. See you then. Bye.